Couple of things I'll mention before I get started. Sometimes I failed to mention this at the beginning. If you're visiting with us and you're looking for a church home, we would love to have you stick around and get to know us a little bit better. It's always great when we can have additional people here with us at Northview, and so sometimes people will make comments when they're registering with our QR code that they're either looking for a church home or they desire to be identified with the congregation. So make sure you reach out to us and let us know exactly what it is that you're looking for. And if you are interested in wanting to make Northview your church home, usually what will happen is you'll mark that either on your card that you'll find on the back of the pew, or if you register with your QR code, and then that way our elders know what to watch out for and then how to contact you and all that kind of thing. And so for those of you who are visiting, let me remind you that aside from right now where we gather at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings, we also meet again at 5 o'clock for our Bible classes, and then we assemble again on Wednesday evenings at 7 o'clock for our Bible classes. And so we'd love to have you with us. And so sometimes I fail to remind everyone what our current meeting times are when we're back here in this place. So I wanted to mention that. Also, Jim, I will tell you, I did notice where the clicker battery might be low, and so just in case it does run out on me, I might have to tell you next slide or something like that. Hopefully it'll hold out until we can get it charged, but don't we just love technology around here? If you're here with us this morning and you have ever seen any of the Star Wars movies, probably a lot of you have, and then there are others of you that maybe don't even have a clue what we're talking about here. And if you don't know what we're talking about, don't worry about it. I can probably explain the situation well enough that where you'll at least get the concept of what I'm going to mention. But in the movie, The Return of the Jedi, those of you who have seen Star Wars movies, and you know, we used to call it the trilogy, but now there are a lot more movies than that. But if you think about the occasion where the Death Star was being rebuilt, and you might remember the good guys were in space travel, you know, and they were being lured into an occasion where it was a trap. And at some point, Admiral Akbar says that out loud. It's a trap. As they realized that the Death Star was actually operational, and so they were trying to turn around, and you know the old phrase, let's get out of Dodge. You see that in the movie where all the spacecrafts are turning around and trying to exit the scene because they knew that it was a trap, and they were trying to get out of that situation. I want you to think about that concept for just a moment, because probably at any point in time in our lives, we can be guilty of falling into a trap. If you think about how there are people, yes, believe it or not, in this life who do want to trap us in certain ways, whether it's trapping us with something that we might do or something that we might say. How about Jesus? Ah, yes. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the Messiah. When he came in the flesh, I think probably most everyone in here is going to be aware of the fact that Jesus was trying to be trapped by different groups of people. And that's actually going to bring us into the text that we're going to go off of this morning in Luke chapter 20. Because we're aware that on different occasions, the Jews, with the different groups represented, would try to trap him. And so when we come into Luke chapter 20, I'm going to read this in just a moment. When we come into Luke chapter 20, I want you to see what the circumstances are in this text. I'm going to allude back to Matthew's account, not only looking at Luke chapter 20, but I want us to see some aspects of where, of course, there's nothing new under the sun, because there have been people, even going back to the time of Jesus, where they were trying to trap him. And of course, entrapment is not our main focus for the lesson today. That's just a lead-in to give you a little bit of context with what's going on. I want to take you to Luke chapter 20. I want us to look at the text that you'll find in verses 19 through 26. It's a trap. Let's see what happens here. The scribes and the chief priests tried to lay hands on him that very hour, and they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. Back when Jesus was talking about the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, in order that they might catch him in some statement, so that they could deliver him to the rule and the authority of the governor. They questioned him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly, and you are not partial to any, but you teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But he detected their trickery and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were unable to catch him in a saying in the presence of the people, and being amazed at his answer, they became silent. It's a trap. But you know who knew this? Jesus knew this. Jesus knew that it was a trap. When you look at how this text lays out in Luke chapter 20, I've got some elements of this text I want us to look at, and then we'll spend the rest of the time this morning looking at some applications for this particular text. So if we go back and we examine some things in this text, back in Luke chapter 20, beginning in verse 19, when you look at the question which is asked to Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Jesus knew that this was trickery. Jesus had already detected this. And I want to give you a little bit more background behind this, because when you go back to Matthew's gospel and you see how this is worded in Matthew chapter 22, it's actually going to be described just a little bit differently. There were some disciples that the Pharisees had sent, but also in Matthew's account it talks about some of the Herodians had come also. Well, of course, Pharisees are the ones who are going to go strictly by the law, and especially even among the Jewish number, if you're talking about zealots, they're going to be so anti-Roman rule, it's not even funny, and there are going to be a lot of things in the background there. But the Herodians, just to give you some background behind what's listed in Matthew, the Herodians are the ones who are going to be in favor of the Roman rule, and they're really going to be supporters of Herod under the Roman rule of Judea there in Palestine at that time. But what's interesting, really, the Pharisees and the Herodians are going to be at odds with each other. And so they are actually enemies with one another. But you know who they have as a common enemy? Jesus. And so, you know, it's amazing how people can come together when they want to launch some type of attack or trickery or a trap against a common enemy. So that's going to be a little bit in the backdrop of what's going on in Matthew's account, and we don't see that as clearly in Luke's account here in chapter 20. So when you look at this trickery which is going on in the text, Jesus is going to be in a tough spot. Because with this question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So if Jesus says, well, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, then he's going to be in trouble with some among the Jews, and they're going to denounce him before the people. If he says, no, it's not lawful, don't pay taxes, then they're going to report him to the Roman authorities. And so this is one of those tough spots that Jesus is going to be in when they're trying to trap him, they're trying to trick him in getting him to land on a particular side in this particular occasion. And of course, when you look at what's going on in the backdrop here, when you've got the issue of the poll tax, when you're talking about this idea, I think it's even worded as a poll tax when you go back and look at the account in Matthew. So to give you an idea, you've got some among the Jewish numbers in the Jewish ranks who would be totally opposed to paying this poll tax, because those among the Jewish numbers who would be against the taxes to Caesar and to the Roman authorities, they would be paying special attention to what was going to be said by Jesus on this occasion. Some of you might remember in Acts chapter 5, when all of this is playing out with being careful about what to do with the first century church and the ways that they were being persecuted and how they were being questioned by the authorities. You might remember some of the things that would be said over in Acts chapter 5. There was a Pharisee named Gamaliel, and if that name sounds familiar, it should be, because he's the one that Saul of Tarsus, later the Apostle Paul, actually studied under. So Gamaliel speaks up, and he's trying to get them in the number here that he's talking to be careful what they do with these men. And there are some individuals that he names. One of them is down in verse 37. He says, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. You're not going to get the big picture by reading this verse, but Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes about this individual, Judas of Galilee, Judas the Galilean, the one that Gamaliel's talking about. The one big reason that he revolted against the Romans because he didn't think it was lawful to pay the poll tax. That gives you a little bit of background. That would have happened in about 6 AD. So this would have been when Jesus was physically younger on the earth, and he would have known about this situation. Some of the Jews were really, really against having to pay taxes to the Romans because they couldn't stand it, for one thing, and they didn't believe that it was lawful for another. So just to give you, again, a little bit of background behind this situation. This is the question which was asked to Jesus as Jesus is trying to be trapped by them. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So the question has been asked, but I want you to notice the answer that Jesus gives. Jesus says, show me a denarius. Now, we don't have any coins in our day and time that we refer to as a denarius, but just to give you some insight here, this was going to be one of the most common coins that you would find. A denarius was an equivalent of a day's wage. And so any of them who were standing right here could probably produce this coin. Now, you know, I'm not good about carrying pocket change with me, but if I was to reach down in my pocket and if I had some coins, you know, one of our most common coins, which is our basic coin, is a penny. Okay, that's equivalent to 1 cent. Well, we use those on a daily basis if we're paying something that we need to pay some change for and things of that nature. And so that's something that we understand, right? And if I was to ask anyone in here whose image is on the penny, well, if you've ever seen that movie Trial and Error, you might even refer to me, the great emancipator. Well, Abraham Lincoln, his image is the one that's on the penny. Well, how do I know this? Because some of y'all accuse me of using gambling money. That's right. Some of y'all have accused me of using gambling money, specifically my kids. Well, you might ask, well, why do they say that? Because when Mama and I play skip-bo, we use pennies to keep up with how many skip-bos we get in a game. And so if you're around us, you're going to see pennies as they start to pile up. And by the way, my mom fusses if she doesn't get near as many skip bows as I do. And she gets tired of me saying, skip bow. I do that every time I get one. And I pull another penny over in my pile. I get all these Abraham Lincolns over in my pile. The more the merrier. And especially if you win. Makes you feel good, right? You get a lot of pennies, and then you win the game. The great emancipator. Any of us can say who's on the penny. We know whose image is on there. Well, when Jesus says, show me a denarius, and you know this is going to be a very common coin, and he says, whose likeness and inscription does it have? It's been debated about which one of the emperors would actually be on this coin. Augustus was technically the first emperor, but the current emperor is going to be Tiberius. And so it doesn't matter which one of those would actually be on this coin, but the fact is, I'd say most likely it was Tiberius because he was the current, that would be the current state of currency at that time. If that was the case, it would be Tiberius. But the point is, it's going to be a Roman emperor. His image, a Caesar, is going to be on the image of this coin. And so as Jesus points this out, as they answer, they said, Caesar's. And he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. They were amazed at this answer, that he could answer this question in the way that he did and not get trapped, not get tricked like their original intent was when they were approaching him in the first place. And so when we look at the big picture with this, of course, you can talk about the idea of paying taxes, and I'll come to that in just a moment when we're looking at some of the application portion of this. But for the fact that Jesus was actually able to answer this question really from multiple facets and to escape their trickery, that they had no answer for that. And it says they became silent because they were amazed at his answer. I want you to consider some things as we go through this text, and I only wanted to spend a little bit of time on this part of it and the backdrop and context and all of that. But I want you to think about some aspects of application, because this text is going to be relevant for us on multiple levels. You know, when Jesus says, and render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. There are things that we know we're going to be obligated to do as sons of God who are living in this world, and that we have governing authorities which are over us. You know, Bryant did a great job reading Romans chapter 13. I'll come back to that in a moment. But when you consider that, okay, there are things that we're going to owe from, a national perspective with governments and all of that, but there are other things pertaining to God that are even going to be more important. And that more so is what I want to focus on this morning in this sermon. And that's why I titled this lesson, The Things That Are God's. The things that are God's. I want us to understand that we owe God everything. And of course, even as the Apostle Paul would say in the sermon at the Areopagus on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, in him we live and move and have our being. So I jotted down some things that I thought would give us a good glimpse of us owing God everything. One of those is our talents and abilities, by the way, that he has given to us. He is the one who has blessed us with these things, and these things are designed to be used. We are to put these things into practice. And when you go look at some places in the New Testament with these different gifts that we have been given, Paul would say in Romans chapter 12 and verse 6 that we are to exercise them accordingly. Well, what happens to certain muscles on your body if you don't exercise them? If you were to just sit there and not move, they're not going to be functional, are they? You've got to, sometimes we use the phrase, use it or lose it. You've got to exercise those different parts of your body to some shape, form, or fashion. I'm not saying you got to go to the gym every day or every week or once a month or whatever, but we've got to find some ways to exercise those parts of our bodies. In a similar manner, when we're talking about different gifts and talents and abilities which have been given to us, we are supposed to exercise these gifts accordingly. And even as Paul will word down in Ephesians chapter 4, as he talks about the body being fitted and held together by that which every joint supplies, and as he says, according to the proper working of each part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. Each part has to do the work that it is designed to do. Well, you've heard me mention this on several occasions before. You know what happens in the church a lot of times? The body's made up of different parts, different members. A lot of times, and this is the church as a whole. I'm not just laying this at Northview. I'm talking about the church worldwide. A lot of times you've got different members of the body that are not doing anything. And before you go, can't believe you said that. Well, it's true. Tell me I'm wrong. That's the way it is worldwide. That's a worldwide problem with the church. That's been a problem since the time the church was established. We've got to make sure to do what we can to make sure that each member of the body, each part of the body is doing what it is supposed to do. Because you just know that's the case. So one of the ways we can help to remedy that is for everybody to try to do their part. Not just showing up for worship, but getting involved in the work of the church. We need to make sure that we can exercise our gifts accordingly and that each part is working properly, according to what Paul would say in Ephesians chapter 4 and then going back to Romans chapter 12. We owe God everything. We need to be using our gifts and abilities and talents that He has given to us. Guess what? He did not give those to us just to sit on a shelf somewhere, because it doesn't do anybody any good if that's the case. Not only for you as an individual, but it robs the body of Christ as a whole if you're not using what God has given you. One of the other aspects that we think of, render to God the things that are God's. Aside from our gifts and abilities that He has given to us, that we owe those things back to Him, we know our time is something that God has given us that we are to use accordingly and that we are to use wisely. Because even as you think back to what Paul will also say, going back to Ephesians chapter 5, as he says, therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. Every day that we wake up, we're going to be on the same time schedule as everybody else who's alive. A second ticks by, a minute ticks by, an hour ticks by, okay? Those of us who are alive, we still have time in front of us. But we know not everybody uses time the same way. I think it's the Alabama football coach, Nick Saban. He has a quote that he is known for saying about wasting time and spending time instead of using it wisely and making the most of it. So I want you to consider that with us as God's people, God gives us this time that we have in front of us, and we are to use it wisely, even as Paul speaks in Ephesians chapter 5. If not, we're just wasting time. And so we need to consider how important it is for us to use it wisely and to make the most of our opportunities. And the third thing, when we talk about owing God everything, one of the things we understand is that we have financial resources. Now, I'll put this picture up on the screen for Brother Yahoo back there. I don't even know if he's mentioned it yet, but some people are into cryptocurrency. Well, I'm not, but I did see one at a hotel a while back. I saw a cryptocurrency exchange machine, which all that's foreign to me. Okay, kind of like saying it's Greek to me. Well, it is, because I don't have any of it. I don't understand it. I've not researched it. Some of you know about this kind of thing. Some of you are going to have investments in the stock market, and you got your 403Bs, your Roth IRAs, and all this kind of thing where you're planning for retirement. So there are different levels of financial obligations and planning that we'll talk about. And we need to understand that God has given us financial resources. We've got jobs where we work to support ourselves with our own hands. But guess what? Ultimately, these things come from God, and He blesses us. And so when we are able to gain these financial resources, we've got obligations. You've got that text in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 where Paul was speaking of the collection on the first day of the week. And in this case, specifically for the saints, where that special collection was taken up. And as you think about the instructions that he gave on the first day of every week, let each of you set aside so there'll be no collections when I come. So you've got that information. You've got the information down in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 with some of the great principles that Paul is going to mention in this particular text, even as he says in verses 6 through 11 about sowing sparingly and reaping sparingly, and sowing bountifully and reaping bountifully, and giving as we purposed in our heart. And we know that God supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, and He'll supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. And you'll be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. God is the one who blesses us with these resources so that we can do these things from a financial perspective to go toward the work of God, to help other people. We don't make money just to support on ourselves and spend on ourselves. We have multiple avenues in which we can reach out and help people and share with others as they have need. In Matthew chapter 25, we've got the parable of the talents. And you think about the financial resources which were given to these slaves. Well, the ones who did what the master wanted them to do, and then of course also rewarded them for, were using them wisely and gaining more. They put them to good use. The one who was wicked and lazy went and hid his in the ground. He didn't use it, and then of course he tried to give it back. God has given us financial resources, and we have these things to use them, and to use them wisely, not just spend them on our pleasures. And then if I can circle back to what was brought up earlier about whether it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not. You go back and look at the information that's contained in Romans chapter 13 that Bryant read for us about paying taxes to the government. We've got these things listed in Scripture. We know that's going to be a responsibility of ours as God's people. One other thing I'll mention. We know that we owe God everything, and you look at the overall picture here, we owe Him our devotion. We owe Him our devotion. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 5, talking about the Macedonians and how they first gave of themselves to the Lord. Well, here's a hint. If you give of yourself first to the Lord, everything else is going to fall into place. In Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, Jesus will say, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Christianity is a life of sacrifice and submission. And if we've got our priorities in the right place, and if we're devoted to God like we should be, everything else will fall into place. Even with the cares and worries of this world in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Let's be devoted to God. We owe Him that as children of His. I want to come back to the image on the coin, regardless of which emperor it was. I want to ask the question, are you living up to your image? Going back to Colossians chapter 3 and verse 10, talking about the life that we are to live as a child of God and how we're to walk in newness of life, not in the old ways, because we've put on the new self. Here's what he says in verse 10. And have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the, watch it, image of the one who created him. Are we living according to the image of the one who created us? Are you living up to your image? Because guess what? Going back to what Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. There are obligations that we have to make for government. But render to God the things that are God's. On the flip side, who is it who's made in the, not the image on the coin, who's made in the image of God? We are. Going back to Genesis chapter 1, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. We're the ones who are made in the image of God, and we owe God everything. Perhaps you're here this morning, but you don't fit the description of the type of life that's living up to that image. Yeah, we all fall short, Romans 3:23, but are you truly striving to be in the likeness of Christ each and every day of your life? If not, and you want prayers, and those who are gathered here, we'd be happy to do that for you and to help you out any way we can. But perhaps there's someone here who has not yet put on the Lord in baptism to be that new creature that's raised to walk in the newness of life. And perhaps this morning you're ready to repent and confess Jesus as the Son of God and to have your sins washed away in baptism so that you can be added to the number of the saved and you'd be ready to walk that new life in Jesus Christ. If we can help you, remember the image of the one that you're made in this morning. Will you come as we stand and as we sing?